And if you want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, of any part of the Constitution, we have to understand how the people who gave it legal force understood it at the time of ratification. And that means going beyond just reading the text, of course, which is the important, essential first step, but also going beyond just reading the Federalist Papers. So today I'm going to share with you three major Federalist sources that were far more influential on ratification than the Federalist Papers, plus, of course, a recommendation and a reminder to read the Anti-Federalists as well. And to kick this off, let's start with James Wilson, who was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court, a top legal mind of the time. And here's how he put it. In his Lectures on Law in 1790, the first and governing maxim in the interpretation of a statute is to discover the meaning of those who made it. Now, Mike Meharry notes that a lot of people thinks this means looking at what the drafters of the Constitution said during the Philadelphia Convention. We've often heard over the years about original intent, and the intention of the people who drafted this in secret somehow is the legal meaning of the document that was ratified by the people of the several states. He said, and while we can get some hints about original meaning from these notes at the Philadelphia Convention, and they are important, we have to take them as part of the entire structure. The drafters don't hold the key. James Madison described it like this. This is in a letter to Henry Lee in 1824. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. The so-called father of the Constitution, it's probably an overrated term for him, but certainly he was quite influential in the drafting of the document and in the ratification process as well. So he played a pretty major role in both parts. And he's specifically saying, in order to understand the Constitution, you have to understand how the people at the time understood it. And those people who gave it, who made the document, the ones who gave it legal force, aren't the people who just drafted it. It's the people who actually debated it and discussed it for legal consideration. Madison continues. He said, and if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers, because the idea that you just read the words and maybe you listen to the intent of the people behind it, and then you find it out what it was later on, or you would make some assumptions, or definitions change over time, that's going to change the structure of the government. That's why to get to the original legal meaning of any legal document, you have to understand how it was understood the moment it was signed. Madison continues. He said, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, like the word necessary, I keep harping on that lately. The word necessary under the Constitution originally was supposed to mean necessary, but over time, starting with Alexander Hamilton and his arguments for the First National Bank, of course, and then John Marshall taking the Hamilton approach later on, a few years later, necessary suddenly meant convenient to government powers. And there isn't, and Thomas Jefferson warned us about this as well, far better than I can, there isn't a single thing that government people will not look at as a convenience for exercising their powers. So if you say that necessary means convenient, you're going to have an unlimited power. You don't need anything else. The entire Constitution could just be the necessary and proper clause. Necessary and proper for whatever they want to do. Anyway, so that's what Madison gets to here. He says, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. And back to Mike Meharry, he points out that to read the Constitution through an originalist framework, to understand the meaning of the Constitution as it's supposed to be understood, not based on how politicians or federal judges tell us what it means today, and then it stays that way until they change their mind, and it's back and forth, and no one knows anything. And this is, of course, arbitrary government, which is one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. It is a definition of tyranny. To read the Constitution, Mike writes, through an originalist framework means we seek to understand how the people understood it at the time. In other words, what they believed they were agreeing to. And that's exactly how Thomas Jefferson put it as well. Here in a letter to William Johnson, 1823, On every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates. And instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text, which is what happens constantly today, or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. Now, again, that just means we have to understand, and I'm going to keep saying the same thing over and over, to understand the Constitution, the legal meaning of the Constitution does not mean just reading a textbook or listening to me or listening to what the Supreme Court happens to say, what the original legal meaning of the Constitution is. You have to actually understand the entire debate at the time. Now, a lot of people think that means, well, just read the Federalist Papers. These are, really famous dudes who wrote this, and they really understood the document, and they were the ones selling to the public. And, well, absolutely. But these really just tell a very small part of what Jefferson described as this spirit manifested in the debates. Now, let's say the Federalist Papers were widely printed and read everywhere during ratification and were influential on whether or not states ratified. And it really wasn't. But let's say they were. They're still only half the story. And if you get and some of these debates, like in Federalist 23 and others, it's back and forth with anti-federalists like Brutus. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the show. So Mike goes on. He points out that the Federalist Papers had very limited influence on ratification. So if they did not influence how they voted on whether to approve the document or not, how can they be considered such a definitive measure of what the Constitution means? And a lot of people treat them like that today. I cite them a lot as well. It depends how you use them. They are not the end of the story. And Mike says, while the Federalist Papers shed valuable lights on arguments used to sell the Constitution to the people, keep in mind, they were primarily written, every single one of them starts out to the people of New York. They were written because the governor and the anti-federalists in New York were very much opposed to ratification as the document stood without amendments. And so there was a very strong sentiment against it. And Hamilton, Madison, and Jay only wrote a few of them, but they decided to work together to convince the people of New York to ratify. So if it's written to the people of New York, were they really so? I mean, that's not the end of the story, of course, because these things can be reprinted and published elsewhere. But by the time New York was considering ratification in July of 1788, so many other states had already gone through their process. So Mike says, while the Federalist Papers shed valuable lights on arguments used to sell the Constitution to the people, and I like how he points out sell, because it was in some ways marketing material. And marketing material can be very much correct, but we also have to understand that it comes from the perspective of the people who want you to go along to buy what they're selling. So maybe there's a little something to consider. And that's why it's so important to understand the back and forth, the Brutuses, the Catos, and Sentinels, and everybody else on the other side. But Mike says they weren't nearly as influential at the time as you might think based on their popularity today. They get cited all the time. In fact, the Federalist essays received only limited circulation outside of New York. And there really is much more than just the Federalist Papers. And here's how Rob Natelson put it. He said, true, the Federalists and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, I did an episode just in June of this year on the founders' education. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson in the 1820s specifically included the Federalist Papers as an essential part of understanding the founding principles. So that's, again, it's a part of it, but it's not the full story. And Natelson puts it this way: the Federalist is among the greatest works of political science ever composed. But the Federalist represents the views of only three, admittedly very influential authors among the scores, perhaps hundreds, who published on the Constitution. So you've got three people's opinions, famous, very well known, but only three out of up to hundreds. The Federalist, Rob writes, would not even be my first choice for introducing students to the Constitution's meaning. And he's a very, very good constitutional scholar, law professor over the years. He's been cited by the Supreme Court maybe close to a couple dozen times. I don't agree with him on everything and strategy and things like that, but he's got a really good research approach that we should listen to. And he says that would be the essays of Tench Cox. And I'll get to Tench in a little bit here. He said, people found the Federalist hard going, which limited its influence. It may have been more important as a talking points manual for the Constitution's advocates than for its direct influence on the ratifying public. And Aaron Coleman points this out as well in a great article at lawliberty.org. He said, treating the Federalists, now he takes a little bit puts a little bit less praise than Rob did on this one. He said, treating the Federalists as a work of political philosophy suggests that the only way to understand the Constitution and the founders' objectives in framing it is through the wisdom of Publius. Publius, of course, was the pseudonym used or the pen name used to sign off every one of these, whether it was John Jay or Hamilton or Madison. And that's the kind of what we get. Oh, what does the Constitution mean? Let's see what Publius had to say. And Publius is the definitive source. We're not looking at who Publius was arguing with or any of the counter arguments or what other people may have said that had a little different perspective or maybe were clearer or better or easier to read or understand or more influential on the people who actually voted to ratify. And Coleman continues, and Coleman is a guy that you guys should be reading as often as possible. You should follow him on Twitter. He doesn't post a lot of stuff, but I really love the kind of broad-based, when it comes to the ratification period, looking for the anti-federalist and the federalist view and not just one side or the other. A lot of people tend to just pick a team just like they do in everything else. Coleman continues, he says, by understanding the Federalist, so this is the mentality. If you only read the Federalist to understand the Constitution, then Publius is the greatest political sage in history. And he said, by understanding the Federalist, then we understand the Constitution and by extension, what it means to be an American. This approach transforms Publius into a philosopher king and the essays into a decoder ring that cracks the mysteries of constitutional meaning. And this, in turn, inclines us to read too much into the Federalist in order to answer our questions. And additionally, it leads to reading Publius in isolation from all other writings and concerns of the ratification debates. Again, like if you're looking at the arguments and they're saying, well, they're referencing some of the opposition, but you don't really know what the opposition is, it's like what they want us to do on almost every political issue today. They want us to frame the debate in a certain way and only hear one side. And so people telling you just to read the Federalists are telling you to only hear one side. And that doesn't mean you have to agree with the other side, but to actually get a full understanding of that debate, you have to read all of it. Anyways, I'm going to link to all these articles, and I'm going to get to these three leading Federalists that I want to mention today in just a moment, but I'm going to link to all this stuff over in the show notes. I'll publish a blog post in the next couple of hours after this live stream is done, and hopefully I've got a little bit of help coming in. Alan Mosley's going to be coming in and helping me do the blog posts starting pretty soon. He's doing some test runs right now to take that off of my plate. That means the blog post will be a little bit later in the day after the show, but still it'll allow me a little time to work on some other projects that I've been skipping out on. Anyways, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find that blog and the show links section so you can read all the stuff that I'm talking about here and find links to the source documents that I'm going to mention here in just a moment on your own time. And while I'm here, I want to say a quick hello to everyone in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. There's Cheriton, Haji, Kirk, Dixie, Peter D, Big John, Shannon, Jeremy, D. Long, and I know I'm Merc Factor. That's a fun one. I appreciate you guys all being here. And thank you, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Let's get right back to it. So what really influenced the meaning of the Constitution? That is, how the people who were ratifying it understood it. And here from Rob Nadelson again, 3 documentary compilations tell us what did and didn't influence the Constitution and the American Union. One is the 34-volume Journals of the Continental Congress. These are the records of the First Continental Congress in 1774, the Second in 75-81, which these are the people who drafted the Articles of Confederation, and then the Confederation Congress of 1781 to 1789. So why do you have to understand, I'm not going to get into much detail here, but why do you have to understand what was going on through the Confederation period? It's not like the Constitution was actually being drafted in a vacuum, like it was just out of nowhere. No, they were really oftentimes referencing stuff that was going on before. Things that were good, that were bad, whether things were going to be expressly delegated. What did that mean? Of course, the taxing system. Patrick Henry was an advocate in support of the requisition system. If you don't know what that was, that's from the Articles of Confederation. So if you don't understand what was going on before, then you don't even know what they were debating as well. So that's essential. Another compilation is Max Ferran's, I don't know how to pronounce that, The Records of the Federal Convention. It's actually 4 now, so there's 1 of the Philadelphia Convention, and then there's 3, there's 4 with state ratification debates, and that's important. And then the third compilation is the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, now at 36 volumes. These are all the letters, all the essays, newspaper articles, Federalist Papers, Anti-federalist Papers, etc., in all the varying states. It is the full picture. I haven't read through all of it even myself. I got a long way to go, but if you really want to get into it, University of Wisconsin has that available for free online, unless you want to spend tons of money on the expensive printed versions. That's the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. So, for example, if you want to look for a word commerce, for example, you want to understand how they understood the word commerce, you would go through all of this history and you would research all the varying ways that they use the word commerce in dictionaries and in all those debates in those 36 volumes, and you'd get a picture of how it was used in context, and therefore you would get a better understanding of what the legal meaning of it was, and it's not what they define it to be today. Or post roads. Post roads, they say today, basically, most people think that it's any road that the mail drives over, but this is absolute nonsense. That's not how the founding generation understood it. Here, back to Aaron Coleman. He said, if we are looking for the most critical Federalist essay, it's not to Publius we turn, but instead to James Wilson's Courthouse Address, or the State House Yard Speech, which received considerable attention and consideration in nearly every state. Dave Benner wrote a great article on this one. Of course, I'm going to link to it in the show notes. He said, though, the Federalist is often cited by academics and federal judges as the definitive commentary on the Constitution, the federal Constitution. The series played only a minor role in securing ratification. James Wilson's State House Yard Speech, on the other hand, framed the way in which friends of the Constitution explained the instrument and answered their many critics. In this way, Wilson's narrative had a much more tangible effect on ratification. Now, Wilson was also in the Philadelphia Convention. He had a bunch of big government ideas. Almost everything he proposed was rejected. So he wasn't really influential as a framer, as a drafter of the Constitution, but he certainly was very, very, maybe the most influential on the Federalist side when it comes to how the Constitution should be read, at least according to how they were selling it. And I know the speech was reprinted all over the place, maybe in every state, but at least 34 newspapers that I've found in a dozen states. I did a whole episode on this. History Ignored, James Wilson's speech on the Constitution. If you want to understand the Federalist case on it, that episode is great. Of course, there's going to be a link to the speech on it as well. Next up I want to talk about is Tench Cox. And Nadelson puts it this way. Tench Cox may have been the most widely read among the general public. So he published a number of 2 series of essays plus some other ones. Of course, we never hear of these things. He was a Philadelphia businessman who served in the Confederation Congress and later as our first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was on board with the Hamiltonian view, so we're not going to be happy about that, but he was great on the right to keep and bear arms and a lot of other stuff. Most of Cox's essays have long been freely available, but until recently, 4 were hidden from all but probably just a very small niche of constitutional scholars, and they were republished a few years ago by the University of Wisconsin. And Rob puts it this way. His essays itemize many of the activities over which the Constitution granted the federal government little or no jurisdiction. So if he's potentially the most widely read Federalist in support of the Constitution, maybe Wilson was more, but it's pretty close. But Tench was very widely read, and he's saying all these things, agriculture and things like that, are going to be health care, are going to be left to the people of the states, and then they ratified based on that understanding. Then the arguments the other way around have far less they're just garbage. Among them, for example, that the federal government would have no jurisdiction were social services, care for the poor and healthcare, education, education, no Department of Education, no government control over religion, real estate, local business, most roads and other infrastructure, no infrastructure spending unless it's kind of interstate highways, for example, nearly all criminal law matters and most civil court cases. So that's how probably the most widely read Federalist in support of the Constitution was describing the powers of the federal government, and then they convinced enough people to get on board. So he wrote a couple of series of essays. One, I'm not going to get into any highlights here. One of them was a 4-part series in 1787 called An American Citizen. And then his primary description of federal limits of power were in 1788 under the essays titled A Freeman. And I'm going to link to these in the show notes. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You should check out all this stuff when you have a chance, especially if you want to geek out on it or you really want to really understand what you're talking about, which is what we're getting into here today. Again, from Aaron Coleman, the next up, so we've got James Wilson, his State House Yard speech, Tench Cox, his American Citizen and Freeman essays in 1787 and 1788, and then John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, the most widely read guy on American liberty in the 1760s, all the way up through Thomas Paine's publication of Common Sense in 1776. This is a really famous guy, very moderate in his approach and how he'd like to try to deal with things, but very well read, highly respected, even from people who were his wicked opponents during the debate over the Declaration of Independence. John Adams couldn't stand him, and then he said, well, this guy's got some honor because he went to the front line, even though he was side stories. But Dickinson was probably the primary drafter of the Articles of Confederation. And then a few years later, he got on board with ratification of the Constitution. He wrote a series of essays called the Fabius ones. And this is how Coleman puts it. Dickinson's Fabius essays, while lacking Publius's comprehensiveness, provide a significantly better explanation of federalism than what is found in the Federalist. You've heard me cite him so many times. For example, I don't cite this one too often, but I need to. Basically, he said in Fabius number 3, if the federal government invades the sovereignties of their several states, it's their own fault for not holding the line. And in Fabius number 4, he told us, well, it doesn't matter what you put on. Well, of course it matters. But ultimately, the end result, no matter how good of a constitution you may come up with, you might still have a bad administration. And mind you, that's all we get today. So you can have the best constitution on earth, and you could still have a bad administration. And when you have that, what is to be done? He said the answer is to be found before the supreme sovereignty of the people. When it's a bad administration, it's the final authority of the people that takes care of it. Now, if the people keep supporting the bad administration, you've got a problem with the people being okay with it. But ultimately, he said, it's the duty of the people to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. In other words, to John Dickinson, it's up to the people to protect and defend their own Constitution and their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. And today, they never, ever like it. So anyways, this was a very, very widely read series of essays as well. Fabius was a really famous Roman general. Of course, we don't know these types of things, who used guerrilla tactics to keep Hannibal at bay. But anyways, they offer probably a stronger and more detailed and probably better written, Coleman writes, discourse on human nature and the necessity of civic virtue as well. And that's an interesting take from Aaron as well. Of course, I'm going to link to Aaron's article, Rob, Mike, Harry, and everybody else. Here's how this is... Is this Meharry again here? He says, who's this one? Oh, this is Rob again. He said, unlike the Federalist or the Aristides essays of Alexander Conti Hansen, Fabius made no attempt to provide a comprehensive overview of the Constitution. Instead, they focused primarily on answering the anti-federalist contention that the Constitution was too high-toned or it would lead to an aristocracy. Now, maybe Dickinson was right, maybe he was wrong, but the point is, if you don't read both sides, you don't read these other authors, you can't really understand it. Now, George Washington thought Fabius was probably some of the best stuff. Here he is in April of 1788, after a ton of those Federalist Papers had already been published, not circulated too far, but we know George Washington was getting access to that stuff. And here he is writing to John Vaughan. Shortly after the first few of the Fabius essays came out, he said, the writer of the pieces signed Fabius, whoever he is, appears to be master of his subject. He treats it with dignity and at the same time expresses himself in such a manner as to render it intelligible to every capacity. So that was one of the issues with the Federalist. It's not easy to read. I don't know if you ever read some of this stuff. A lot of it, especially if you don't understand the references that they're making, is hard reading. They're referencing stuff that happened during the Confederation period or debates from Brutus and Sentinel and others and Cato. And so it's not as easy to follow along. Washington's pointing out, like, anybody can understand what John Dickinson is saying here in Fabius. And that's really, really important because we're talking about not a constitution for the powerful and influential. It's supposed to be for the people of the several states holding that final authority, that sovereignty. Anyways, Washington continued, I have no doubt but an extensive republication of these essays would be of utility in removing those impressions which have been made upon the minds of many by an unfair or partial representation of the proposed constitution, and would afford desirable information upon the subject to those who seek for it. In other words, he thought it was really potentially very influential. It certainly was. It was published all over the place, these series of essays. There are 9 of them. I'm going to link to consource.org where you can read all of them. They've got them in order here. Hopefully the link stays the same. Sometimes they change this stuff over time. But ultimately, if we want to understand what the Federalist Papers are saying, what these leading, probably far more influential Federalist advocates of the Constitution were saying, John Dickinson, James Wilson, Tench Cox, and of course any others, we also have to understand, and I keep saying this, the other side of the debate. And I know for those of you guys who watch or listen to the show for some time, you know I go through series of these Anti-Federalist Papers. I've wrapped up all episodes on all of the Brutus essays, all of the Cato essays. I've got one more episode on Patrick Henry's Anti-Federalist speeches. I'm also going to cover some on Federal Farmer and Sentinel and many others because we want to get the full picture here. If we're going to do education on the Constitution and its original meaning and then how to defend it when government refuses to do so, which is all the time, we got to understand what it actually is supposed to mean. So we have to understand that other side of the debate, and that means reading the Anti-Federalists, Brutus, Cato, Federal Farmer, Sentinel, Patrick Henry, Mercy Otis Warren, Columbian Patriot is another good one as well. I was recommended a book, if you're looking up on the screen here, I was recommended a book that I have not read yet, but from some people that I highly respect, that actually from my understanding, the way that the book is laid out is it takes Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers and it organizes them by topic. And you can see the back and forth right in front of you. The concept of the book sounds awesome. It is co-authored by Aaron Coleman, who I think is awesome. Another guy, Gary Gregg, who I'm not familiar with. So I just wanted to mention that one to you as well. This is something I intend on reading as soon as I get a chance. We'll see. I've got a pretty long list, but I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. This is kind of more deep, geeky, constitutional type of stuff that I don't always like sharing because it's not as exciting to the algorithms out there. But I think it's important to try to reach and teach as many people as possible about these founding principles. And nothing helps us do that work every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, throw it our way. And we know they don't like us taking a stand against the empire, the largest government in history, but we're going to continue doing it. We're 17 years strong, setting up for the next 17 years. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Taking a look over on the chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. Jeremy says they only have 31 of the volumes available for free, talking about the University of Wisconsin, the documentary history. And yes, Jeremy also points out that the website is difficult to navigate. It is. We're beggars can't be choosers kind of situation here. The printed volumes I've never even considered getting because they're way too expensive. So the search function isn't all that awesome. It's hard to use sometimes, but if you want to get really, really deeply into it, that's where you're going to go. But otherwise, I'm going to link to in the show notes, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. You're going to be able to find these series of essays by Tench Cox. You're going to find James Wilson's State House Yard speech. You're going to find the 2 sets of essays by Tench Cox plus all the Fabius essays. And those are very easy to find, and you can save them however you want, etc. But very important information. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had a great weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.